Hello and welcome to Thikana's US election special, brought to you from New York. I'm Nadir Rahman. Well, here it is, election day, and every single one of those polls we've been reading about for months will be put to the test. But fear not, because across the next 2 hours, you'll hear from elected officials and journalists, while we'll also give you real-time updates from swing states. To help us untie the Gordian knot of US presidential elections, in studio today we have New York State Representative and mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. Joining him, we have the editor-in-chief of Thikana Digital, Khaled Muhiuddin. I'm going to start with a question for Mr. Mamdani. I'm going to take a quote off your state assembly page. Right? This is a quote off your biography. Zohran co-founded the school's first ever cricket team, which would also go on to participate in the public school athletic league's inaugural season. This act, though not ostensibly a political one, taught him how to overcome together with a few like-minded individuals who can transform rhetoric into reality. I don't just quote cricket because I'm speaking to a majority Bangladeshi audience, but I guess my question to you is over here. As we find ourselves on election day, which group of like-minded individuals are set to transform their electoral rhetoric into reality?
You know, it's hard to say. I think that so much of the analysis that has been conducted has shown that we are basically at a 50-50 percentage for both parties. And I think what's important for us to remember, and what that example reminds me of, is that voting is one act that we take as part of our practice, of our politics, of our expression, of our political values, but it is not the only act. And that no matter what happens today, that we have to ensure that tomorrow and the next day after that, we continue to work to transform that rhetoric into reality. Because that is something that the world deserves of us, and that is something that we have to offer to the world.
In this moment, do you believe any one party has the rhetoric that will resonate with people today? Or does it feel like this is a election season, one of slog, one which we've had to struggle through it, and eventually somebody will be decided, but not on the basis of their rhetoric and what they're promising, but kind of as a second place, that nobody's quite happy with the options in front of us? How do you feel about that?
I have definitely heard from many New Yorkers about a feeling of despair in this moment. And I think that is in many ways a prevailing sense across this country about the state of this country and the state of the world. I do think, however, that it's important to separate out what we have seen the Trump campaign put forward as a vision is a vision that, in their own words, promises the largest ever deportation program to begin on the first day of President Trump's potential presidency. And there is a great sense of fear about what that presidency could mean. I do think that we are missing a little bit of hope in our politics today. But I think that combination of fear and the prospect of breaking from a number of aspects from the Biden administration into this next presidential term, one that I hope we will see to have a completely different course on the question of Gaza, on the question of Palestinian human rights, that hope, that aspiration is one that we have to continue to fight for after this election.
It is interesting that you mentioned hope over here, hope being the cornerstone of Barack Obama's election campaign. As it turned out, his 8 years in office, more people were deported under his administration than any previous administration. And we find ourselves in this critical moment today on election day, with immigration being one of the most important topics. But the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans has narrowed so much on this issue. To me, and I think to many people out there, it seems like they're virtually on the same page. How does one make sense of that when one goes to vote today? When one goes to vote in a city like New York, which is made by immigrants for immigrants? What does that mean?
So, I would first say that I don't think they're on the same page. We do have to hear Trump in his own words. I mean, the largest ever deportation program, language around immigrants poisoning the blood of this country, that is markedly different than what Democrats are speaking about, both on a policy level and on a rhetorical level. But I do take the point, which is that the Democratic Party, and I say this as a Democrat, has absolutely moved away from some of our core tenets when it comes to the question of immigration. And I think what that means and what it has shown us is the need for us to have a more humane policy, especially as you say here in New York City. And I say this as an immigrant myself. I came to this city when I was 7 years old, got my citizenship just 6 years ago. I'm now a state assembly member. I'm running for mayor. These are the kinds of ways in which immigrants are a part of the fabric of our society.
Sure. Khaled bhai, আপনি যদি আমাদেরকে একটু বলতেন, what are your thoughts on this election season in America? একটু বলতেন আমাদেরকে।
আসলে আপনি দেখেন যে আমার পাশে যিনি বসে আছেন তিনি কিন্তু আসলে স্পষ্ট বললেন যে ডোনাল্ড ট্রাম্প আসলে ইমিগ্রেন্টদের বিরুদ্ধে যে একটা ব্যবস্থা নেওয়ার কথা বলতেছেন, তিনি ডিপোর্টেশনের কথা বলতেছেন। তিনি 2016 সালে যখন ইলেকশন ক্যাম্পেইন করছেন তখনও তিনি একই ধরনের কথা বলছেন। কিন্তু ইউ রাইটলি পুট আউট যে আসলে তো এটা ব্যক্তি বা ডেমোক্রেট থেকে রিপাবলিকানদের এরকম আলাদা করে না, তারা একই ধরনের পলিসি প্রায় নেয়। বারাক ওবামার সময় আসলে অনেক বেশি লোক কে আসলে ডিপোর্ট করা হয়েছে, যদিও আমেরিকানরা নিজেদেরকে খুব গর্ব অনুভব করে যে এটা ল্যান্ড অফ ইমিগ্রেন্টস, তারপরেও এটা করতেছে। কিন্তু আমার কাছে কিন্তু মনে হয় যে ডেমোক্রেট এবং রিপাবলিক এবার রাইটলি পুট ইট আউট যে এদের মধ্যে থেকে কিন্তু অনেক বিষয়ে দূরত্বটা অনেক বড় না, বরং দূরত্বটা আসলে ছোট। তারা বেশিরভাগ সময় একই রকম ভাবে কাজ করে থাকে। আমি কিন্তু যদি আপনি আমাকে ফ্র্যাঙ্কলি বলেন, আমি ক্লিনটন অ্যাডমিনিস্ট্রেশনের কোনো ফরেন পলিসির সাথে যদি আপনি বলেন বুশ জুনিয়রের ফরেন পলিসির অনেক বড় তফাৎ আমি দেখতে পাই না। আসলে বারাক ওবামা যেরকম প্রেসিডেন্ট ছিলেন, ডোনাল্ড ট্রাম্প প্রায় একই ধরনের প্রেসিডেন্ট থাকেন, বাইডেনও একই ধরনের প্রেসিডেন্ট থাকেন। কিন্তু আসলে মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্র বা ইউনাইটেড স্টেটস অফ আমেরিকার লোকজনের জন্য ইলেকশনটা একটা উৎসব হইতে পারছে বা একটা ভোটটাকে একটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হইতে পারছে, কারণ তারা মনে করে বা অ্যাটলিস্ট এই দেশের ইনস্টিটিউশনগুলি তাদেরকে মনে করাইতে পারে যে ইউ ক্যান চেঞ্জ whenever you want to। তুমি তোমার মতটা দিতে পারো, ইউর মতামত, তোমার যে ওপিনিয়ন দ্যাট কাউন্টস। আমাদের দেশে বা আমাদের মতো দেশগুলির মতো অনেকগুলি দেশে এটা কিন্তু আমরা আসলে মনে করতে পারি না অনেক বছর ধরে, 15 বছর ধরে। এর নিয়ে নানা রকম কথা আছে যে হ্যাঁ ট্রাম্প কিরকম প্রেসিডেন্ট হবেন, হ্যারিস কিরকম প্রেসিডেন্ট হবেন, কিন্তু এইটা নিয়ে কিন্তু কোনো দ্বিমত নাই। যদি মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের লোকেরা মনে করে যে ওকে আসলে প্রেসিডেন্ট রাখবে না, ওকে আসলে সে চায় না, সেটা হইতে পারে। আপনি দেখেন বাইডেন এইবার কিন্তু কমলা হ্যারিসের এই রানটাতে আসারই কথা না, আসার কথা হচ্ছে বাইডেনের। কিন্তু যেহেতু এটা বোঝা গেল যে বেশিরভাগ জনগণ ওকে আর চাইতেছে না, নট ইভেন এজ এ ক্যান্ডিডেট, এটা কিন্তু তাকে আসলে ক্যান্ডিডেট পদ থেকে তাকে বাদ দেওয়া হয়েছে। সুতরাং দিস ইজ দি বিউটি। এছাড়া যদি আপনি মনে করেন, ফাইনালি আমি শেষ কথা বলি যে আপনি যদি এটা মনে করেন যে না মানে গণতন্ত্রের ক্ষেত্রে এইদার অর আমি আসলে কামালাকেও পছন্দ করি না, ট্রাম্পকেও পছন্দ করি না, এরকম একটা জায়গায় নিয়ে আমাকে পাঠানো হয়েছে যেখানে এই দুইজনের একজনেরই আমার কোনো পছন্দ না, সেইটা একটা হইতে পারে। আর শেষ কথা আমি কামালা হ্যারিস সম্পর্কে বলি, যত কথাই উনি বলুক মাইগ্রেশন নিয়ে, ইউ ক্যান ট্রান্সলেট ইট টু ইউ। আমি যেটা বলতে চাই যে কামালা যেহেতু একটা মানে ভিজিবল ইমিগ্রেন্ট মানে ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড থেকে আসছেন, এখানে আপনি দেখতে হবে কিন্তু কাদেরকে আমাদের ইমিগ্রেন্ট মনে হয়, যারা একটু কালো, যারা একটু হিস্পানিক, যারা একটু দেখতে কম সুন্দর, যারা একটু কম সাদা, তাদেরকে আমরা বেশিরভাগ সময় ইমিগ্রেন্ট বলি। যদিও ডোনাল্ড ট্রাম্প নিজেও ইমিগ্রেন্ট, মানে আমেরিকা তো দেশই ছিল না, আসলে বাইরে থেকে আসছে, কিন্তু ওদেরকে একটু ইমিগ্রেন্ট মনে হয়। এবং যাদেরকে ইমিগ্রেন্ট মনে হয় তাদের আসলে বাংলা একটা কথা আছে না, ওরকে মরিয়া প্রমাণ করতে হয় যে সে মরে নাই। সেই জন্য আপনি দেখবেন ওবামা কিন্তু যেহেতু সে অর্ধেক কালো অর্ধেক সাদা এরকম ছিল, ওকে কিন্তু ইমিগ্রেন্টদের জন্য আরো বেশি কঠিন পলিসি নিয়ে প্রমাণ করতে হয়েছে যে ও ওদের পক্ষে না। কামালাকেও একই জিনিসই করতে হবে। সো এই দিক দিয়ে আমি খুব আলাদা কিছু দেখি না।
I'm going to offer a quick translation. He went through many different points, Khaled bhai over here for us. But he said, like, on some issues, while the Democrats and the Republicans might be close together, there's this central issue of in this country that you can express your power at the ballot box. That is the moment where you can actually make a change. Khaled bhai and myself, both of us from Bangladesh, for the longest time, we haven't been able to express ourselves like that for a myriad different reasons over there. But he's talking about generally how kind of incredible that is. And then Khaled bhai, I think he went into something that was so valid over here. We talk about this country being responsive to the people. The people didn't want Joe Biden to run again. And it is incredible that for the first time in the history of a presidential campaign, somebody willfully stepped down, heard the voice of the people. So Khaled bhai's basic point was, while the two parties, at least in my estimation, and in some other people's estimations, might have come closer together on some issues, while still being, of course, markedly different from each other. The fact of the matter is that the people over here are the people who have the power. This brings me back to, honestly, the rhetoric that comes from you all the time about how the power is with people. It is actually with them. And today, a day like today, historic day where everybody is going out to vote, it's a day where you can decide for yourself what vision of the United States that you want. And you, as a mayoral candidate, I'm interested to know, because being mayor of New York City, the United States' largest city, largest metropolitan area, most diverse, what vision would you say you share in your mayoral campaign, in those hopes, dreams, and ambitions that would be similar to the Democratic vision put forward by Kamala Harris and the Democrats this time? Would you find any area of similarity in the visions you're offering for governance?
First, I would just say, I was born and raised in Uganda, in East Africa, and elections were often a show, a performance. We knew the result in advance. And so it is truly something that I still hold dear, that this is not simply an exercise. This is one where people can determine the outcome.
Sure.
And I think that we need to ensure that that continues to be the case across this country, because sometimes you can take it for granted and it becomes a thing of the past as opposed to a thing of the future. To your question about the similarities between Vice President Harris's vision and my mayoral vision, there's actually another person that comes to mind when I think of Vice President Harris's vision, and that is Lina Khan. She chairs one of the most important agencies in the United States, which intervenes on behalf of American consumers against monopoly powers like the corporations that control so much of our lives. And she is somebody who has time and time again made it easier for the American consumer to actually carry out what their will is, whether it's canceling a subscription, whether it's being able to get a refund from an airline, finally getting a little bit of relief in a cost of living crisis. My mayoral campaign is about that same cost of living crisis. We know that if President Trump wins, Lina Khan is not going to be anywhere near the White House. No. We know that if Kamala Harris wins, that is the only chance that there is a Lina Khan at the head of that agency. And similarly, with this mayoral campaign, we are fighting for the same kind of relief for New Yorkers, to tell them that in the midst of a cost of living crisis that Mayor Adams has taken almost every opportunity to exacerbate, we are in fact going to not just recognize it, but rectify it. And what that means is freezing the rent for more than 2 million New Yorkers, making the bus free for more than 1 million New Yorkers who ride it every day, and making childcare a reality for every New Yorker, whether they're 6 weeks of age or they're 5 years old. Because for the families that have young children in the city, they cannot afford to raise them here because of what our mayor has done to universal childcare.
Well, thank you so much for that. You've laid out your vision, and this is your stump speech, dare I say, And at least something that resonates very closely, I know, with a number of New Yorkers in terms of what's happening right now, is the rent freezes. Could you speak more about that? Because the last 2 years of rent increases have been the highest they've been since the early 90s. And the cost of living problem, I don't know how people are managing with it, but also I hear the big criticism is what happens to the people who own the buildings? What about their cost of living increases?
So to that question, I would first say that the owners of rent stabilized buildings, they have access to a program from the city where they can apply for relief if they are able to show that their expenses are actually higher than the revenues that they are making from their tenants. Separately, I've been a legislator in Albany, which is where a lot of these rent laws are fought about. And what we did last year was against my will, and I voted in opposition to this, but we created a new loophole for landlords to raise the rent on rent stabilized tenants through the claim of an improvement being made to the apartment. So even though I'm advocating for a rent freeze, I am doing so while these landlords have a myriad ways that they can actually raise the rent on tenants. This is just one way of providing relief. Now for the tenants, more than 2 million New Yorkers live in these units. These units are supposed to be the bedrock of economic security. And as we know, for many immigrant New Yorkers and also for Bangladeshi New Yorkers, housing is the #1 cost they are facing on a monthly basis. And if you are a senior or if you are on a fixed income, it doesn't matter if your landlord raises the rent 1% or 9% like Eric Adams has, where are you going to get that extra money? And I have had Bangladeshi constituents of mine call my office and tell me, I can't find any extra money. So am I just not supposed to get my groceries, or am I just not supposed to get my medicine? What am I supposed to do?
Thank you for that. And we're going to go to our first guest. But before we go to our first guest, I'd like to thank Khaled Muhiuddin for being here with us, sharing your views. They were very insightful. Thank you so much as we go to our first guest.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
And today, I'd like to introduce Shaniat Chaudhry. Shaniat is a freelance investigative journalist from Queens, New York. He might be in Queens, New York, but he's reporting to us from London. So in his reporting, the topics he touches on affect migration, displacement of people of the Greater Asia region, including Palestine and Bangladesh. He is a former Democratic candidate for U.S. Congress from New York's 5th District, and he holds a degree in U.S. foreign policy from NYU, and that degree is going to come into use over here, Shan, as we ask you the important questions of how being in London, what's the vibe that you're getting? How is this election being viewed in Europe?
Hey, thank you for having me, and nice seeing you, Assembly Member Zoran. Good luck on your election. Thank you for having me on today. Yeah, I mean, I've been in London for the last couple weeks now, and there's a lot of nervous energy. People are very ready to tune into what's going to happen tonight and what, the results we may not know for a few days, depending on how tight it is. So people are eager to see what will happen as the fallout of the election could impact not just the United States, but what's happening globally, especially with what we're seeing out in Palestine and Lebanon and elsewhere.
And I'm going to broaden the question a little bit more, right? This U.S. election is obviously viewed by actors in Europe, and because I think a lot of the issues regarding this U.S. election in Europe, people's fears are about how, whichever way this election goes, what it means for Ukraine. I was wondering if you had any kind of sense as to what a democratic vision would look like for Ukraine in 2025, or a Republican vision would look like for the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think with the conflict in Ukraine, we see that the U.S. government still is really imposing themselves not in multiple parts of the world. We're seeing what's happening out in the Middle East, but with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, they've been trying to get to a peace deal for a very long time and still has yet to happen. So we've seen the same repetitive talking points happen, whether it be under a Democratic or Republican administration. We may not know when this will come to an end, and it could prolong as long as whoever's in power. This will continue to happen for a while.
It's interesting that you say it may continue to happen for a while, because at least over here, the rhetoric coming from the Republican side is Donald Trump has been very open and very clearly he said that if he gets elected, he will go to President Putin and he'll end the war immediately. And this idea of basically Donald Trump's strength with President Putin, the closeness of that relationship. In Europe, how does that closeness of the relationship between Donald Trump and President Putin, how is that viewed in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, people do see that there is a very problematic nature of a relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Even though Donald Trump has mentioned that he would end the war, I mean, we know that he is an isolationist and he's tried to serve an isolationist policy, but it's also been hypocritical. We've seen what he's done in Syria. We've seen what he's done in continuing the onslaught of Afghans in Afghanistan, right? Continuing foreign policy that has hurt a lot of people. So whether or not he pulls out in making sure that Russia ends the war in Ukraine, what is really concerning for, I think, a lot of people is seeing how he will use a lot of backdoor deals to make sure that even though Putin may end the war in Ukraine, doesn't mean there necessarily will stop aggression towards Ukrainians or other parts of Europe.
And Shania, a lot of your reporting is on migration and displacement, and specifically about Palestine, in the region of Palestine. Could you offer us some thoughts? Could you tell us because when it comes to Palestine, there are many different stakeholders, and unfortunately, oftentimes we don't speak of the Palestinian people themselves as a stakeholder in their own future. But I guess I'm asking for a take from Europe. What is the European take that maybe what would a Kamala Harris presidency do for the war in Palestine? Would she be any closer to ending it? What do you think her European allies are saying?
Yeah, I mean, here, since I've been in London, there's been very similar energy of wanting to end the aggression that's happening towards Palestinians. And you're absolutely right. We don't tend to, especially in Western mainstream media, we don't tend to center the voices of Palestinians, of other Muslims and Arabs when it comes to injustices like this. And Assembly Member Zoran Mandami, he knows better than anyone about how long this has been going on for. So we've seen the last couple of days, the last few weeks, there's been protest rallies in trying to really push the energy towards American voters, especially in trying to whether utilize their votes or continue on protesting in the streets to really put more pressure on the not just the Biden administration, but we have to remember that Vice President Harris has been in this administration as long as this aggression has been going on since October 7th. So she's had opportunities and she's had a lot of power to influence the decision making to ending this, and she hasn't. So there are a lot of Europeans who are really upset, and they're taking high actions to make sure that Americans do the right thing and making the voices heard, whether it be at the election polls. And I think the biggest thing I think the whole world knows is that whatever happens tonight or the next few days as fallout the results is that there are Palestinians who are still dying. The Lebanese people are still being attacked at the border. So I think that there's a lot of attention in trying to tune in to see what's going to happen tonight, because just earlier today, Israel killed more Palestinians. They killed more Lebanese people, and it's happening on Election Day. So people are still concerned about this.
And I guess of interest to us over here is, as you're based in London and you are an American in London, a US citizen there, what is it that you're hearing from the people on the ground over there? Because whether we like it or not, people around the world have an extreme interest in this election, whether it affects them directly or not. What are people on the ground saying to you? Do they ever look at you and like, the American from New York, what do you think? But what are they saying to you?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see how much of the US politics is literally on the thread of what could happen to the rest of the world. I mean, American politics does reflect a lot of what will happen here in the UK in the next 5 to 10 years, right?
Yeah.
And I think that especially in the Western world, we have a lot of our Arab Muslim diaspora here in the UK as well. So these are the folks who still have family back home who are losing their loved ones, who are losing their homes, right?
Yeah.
Even while I was out reporting in Lebanon and Palestine, there are a lot of people from the diaspora who are having to make tough decisions about being there in the center of facing deadly attacks by the day, but then also having to make a tough decision when it comes to making the voices heard at the poll today. So there's a lot of tough decisions. There's a lot of mixed feelings about what could happen tonight. I think there's a lot of nervousness just because of how tight this race will be. But beyond that, neither candidate has shown any kind of compassion and any kind of support towards the Palestinians in ending this aggression.
I'm going to ask you one last question before we head out. The idea of of a special friendship between the United States and England, is it still as powerful as it was during the Bush and Blair era, or have things changed since then? Is the relationship different?
It's still the same. The U.S. Whatever the U.S. does, the U.K. will follow, and we've seen it time and time again, especially when it's come to the Israeli aggression in Palestine. So even though Stammer might have said he might pull out some arms, we've seen that the UK continues to supply a minimum of arms towards Israel to continue their attack. So it doesn't really change much. The relationship, I don't foresee changing in the future. It's still as strong as it is, as it has always been. And these are the biggest colonial powers in the Western world. So I don't necessarily see it changing, especially when they are opposing other regimes. When you look at China, when you look at Russia, Iran today. So that's not changing anytime soon, no.
Shania, thank you so much for your time. And Brigitte.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now joining us in the studio, replacing Khaled Muhiuddin, is award-winning journalist and senior editor at the Fuller Project, Maher Sattar. Maher, who previously spent a decade covering South and Southeast Asia for outlets such as the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and the Washington Post, also covered the 2020 primaries and general election for CBS. And with that in mind, the fact that you covered this election 4 years ago, I guess I'm going to kick it off with a question to you. What has changed between 2020 and 2024?
That's a really good question, because I think it's one of the things that I've been wondering is, why are we in, I would say 8 years after 2016, stuck kind of in the same issues. I would say a lot of the campaign issues that I'm seeing people split over are very similar to the issues that we were seeing in 2016, and a lot has changed since then. And I think the biggest shift that I would say is not so much that I'm seeing a ton of energy, the same energy on the Trump side, and this is me, this is what I'm observing. I wouldn't say that I'm seeing a ton of the same energy on the Trump side that I was seeing in 2016. I remember in 2020, it felt like the energy on the Trump side was a little bit flat compared to the energy on the Democrat side. There was a lot of enthusiasm for getting Trump out of office at that time. The big difference that I'm seeing now is I think that energy on the Trump side is still not as strong as it was perhaps in 2016. But the big difference I'm seeing now is that energy that the Democrats had in 2020 has been drained. That's not really there in the same way. There's a lot of fear, I think now, that is motivating a segment of the Democratic Party's base to be really active, to protect democracy as they see it. But I think after 4 years of Biden-Harris administration, there isn't that same enthusiasm to get Trump out of office or to keep the status quo going. I think that has been a big shift.
So what you've just described to me is interesting. So you've described kind of like fear being the driving factor for the Democrats from your observations, and the Republicans being not having as much energy as they had, of course not in 2016, maybe even in 2020. Can fear itself elect the next president of the United States? Is a question for both of you.
Yeah, I think fear it can be a huge motivator, right? It motivates me a lot in my life. I think it can. We can debate whether or not that's the best motivator, right? I think there's a lot of criticism that the Democratic Party gets, probably justifiably, that their campaign this season has been really focused, and I feel like this was the case in 2020 as well. The campaign has been very focused on stopping Trump. And I think it's true that it has taken this kind of negative tone mostly. I think that doesn't need to be negative. It doesn't need to be fear-driven. There's a lot to be said for being positive about democratic politics, right? About the importance of democracy. And it would be quite interesting to see campaigns that lean into that a little bit more rather than just negative, this person is going to ruin everything. But yeah.
Zoran, your thoughts on that?
I think I agree that fear can be a powerful motivator, and I think that there are many Americans who have deep fears about what a second Trump presidency would look like. And I also think some of the most compelling moments, I think, in this presidential contest have been on this question of cost and what will life look like for the average American in their day-to-day expenses under either of these presidencies. And the moments that I think that have broken beyond that question of fear or just oppositional is the question of cracking down on price gouging as something that has the potential to actually change how Americans go to the grocery store and what their experience is when they go into these stores that they are facing incredible increases for day-to-day items. That is something that has been proposed by the Harris campaign, and then I think the contrast to that has also been what the Trump campaign has proposed with regards to tariffs and just how that would drive up a lot of those same items' costs over the next 4 years.
Zoran, I have a question kind of specifically for you, right? Please. With the primary losses of Cori Bush in Missouri and Jamal Bowman in Westchester, New York, two of the most outspoken progressives in Congress and members of the squad, is there a danger that the progressive movement in the United States might have peaked?
I don't think the progressive movement has peaked, and I think that what we have to do is understand that in the context of what AIPAC said they wanted to do. They initially said they were going to raise $100 million to take out 6 members of the squad.
Yeah.
And now they are attempting to paint a picture where they defeated, 2 of those 6 members as being an evidence of a complete victory over their ideological opponents. And what we've in fact seen is that a number of those very members of that squad either were not primaried or beat back primary challengers like Summer Lee.
Yeah.
I think there is no question that this was a setback. These are two incredible legislators who had stood up time and again for a politics with no exception, and who had delivered tangible gains for their constituents and for people across this country. I mean, I think about Cori Bush and what she was able to win with the eviction moratorium. And she literally quite kept people in their homes by keeping herself out of hers for one night and being at the White House, at the steps of the Capitol. So we have to now prove that this movement has not peaked, and I do think that there will be many an opportunity in the months and the years to come to show that setbacks should not be confused for the end of any kind of a movement.
Sure. So you're describing it as a setback, but in terms of like the larger electoral politics, the map of the United States, 2 out of 6 going. It's a kind of a large number of people going, right? But my question to you is, how does this bode well for your mayoral campaign, as you are very proudly and very openly a socialist? How does that make sense over there? Like with these losses at this kind of national level, and then you putting forward this socialist campaign. Is this the wrong time for a socialist campaign for the mayor of New York?
I think it's actually the perfect time.
Okay.
And I think that one of the reasons for that belief is that these losses have been framed as if they are referendums on whether or not you can stand up for Palestinian human rights in this country as a politician. Yet what we've seen is that when AIPAC poured in tens of millions of dollars to defeat both Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, they primarily spent that money on advertisements and commercials that had nothing to do with Israel. And the reason I bring that up is that it is indicative of the fact that even AIPAC knows that Israel is not the winning issue that it used to be. And we can see that being borne out in poll after poll, where we see majorities of Americans in favor of a ceasefire, in favor of an arms embargo, in favor of extending basic human dignity to Palestinians. And so when I run for mayor across the city, and I'm in all 5 boroughs, and I'm speaking to New Yorkers, I find that there are far more people who agree with the idea that Palestinians deserve everything that every other people deserve. And that means liberty, and that means humanity, and that means safety and freedom. And that, alongside advocating for, taking direct action on a cost of living crisis, I do believe is a platform that will resonate with many New Yorkers.
And I'm going to ask a question for the panel over here. And I feel like from an answer you gave me earlier about like how you do see the stark differences between the Democrats and the Republicans on the topic of immigration, which I think there are different, but in many different ways they're quite similar. I guess my question is, as the Republicans have moved rightward, more towards the right, they seem to have pulled the Democrats with them on a number of different issues, including immigration, which I think maybe we agree on, maybe we don't. This rightward shift from the Democrats is a stark contrast. By rightward, taking them more towards the center. A stark contrast from 2016. And from a biography that I read of you, 2016 was the election that really encouraged you to think about like politics over here. This move to the center for the Democrats, it might pay off in this election, but is it a long-term strategy for them moving forward? This is for both of you.
I think that what you have pointed out about the shift in immigration policy is stark in contrast to 2016, but also in contrast to 2020. And I think that what we've seen is that Republicans are interested in one thing, and that is winning. And they do not care what principles they have to sacrifice in order to get there. And they will continue to go even further to a right-wing pole that we may not even know exists at this point, frankly. And it's extremely important for Democrats to offer an alternative vision. Because if all you are offering is Republican light, then it is not motivating enough for voters. And that is why I do think that, in many ways, what we have right now is, as you were pointing out, it is in some ways a referendum on Trump. I do think that for the Democratic Party as a whole, it is extremely important to defeat Trump and extremely important to continue to make clear to Americans what the difference of vision is. And what stays in my mind are the words of FDR about 100 years ago, when there was another fascist rally at Madison Square Garden. The year prior, FDR had said, in looking at the demise of democracies across Europe, that he did not see it as a demise because people disliked democracy. He saw it as a decision that many people had taken to sacrifice their liberty in the hope of finding something to eat.
Yeah.
And it is that same issue that people, if given enough despair in their life, are willing to consider any alternative. And what we have to do as a party and as Americans across this country is to take action on that despair wherever it may live, so that people understand that that alternative can exist, and it can actually come about as a reality for us if enough of us start to take action on it.
Maher, I'm going to get to your answer in a bit. I'm sorry, we've got another guest joining us right now. Now we have Shahidul Islam, the news editor of Thikana News, who's reporting from a polling center for us. So we get a little bit of an idea of what's happening on the ground. Shahidul, when you're ready.
Yes.
Shahidul bhai, can you hear me?
Nader, আমরা এখন আছি কুইন্সের, নিউ ইয়র্ক সিটির কুইন্সের PS69 স্কুল, যেটা জ্যাকসন হাইটসের প্রাণকেন্দ্রে অবস্থিত। এবং আমরা এই কেন্দ্রে আসার আগে যখন যারা ভোট দিয়ে বের হচ্ছিলেন, আমরা তাদের সঙ্গে কথা বলেছি। এখানে প্রচুর বিপুল সংখ্যক লোক ভোট দিচ্ছেন, তাদের মধ্যে ডেমোক্রেট আছেন, রিপাবলিকানরা আছেন। তো আমি দু একজনের সঙ্গে কথা বলেছি ইনস্ট্যান্টলি একটু আগে, যারা ভোট দিয়ে বের হয়েছেন, তার মধ্যে বাংলাদেশিরাই আমি দেখছি বেশি এই কেন্দ্রটাতে। তারা বললেন যে কেউ যেমন ডেমোক্রেট, তারা বলেছেন যে আমি আমার প্রার্থীকেই ভোট দিয়েছেন, মানে কমলা হ্যারিসকে। আবার অনেক ডেমোক্রেটরা বলছেন যে এই মুহূর্তে বলতে যাচ্ছি না। তার মানে আমার কেন জানি মনে হচ্ছে যে এই অনেক ডেমোক্রেটরা এবার মানে সিদ্ধান্ত বদলে ট্রাম্পকে ভোট দিচ্ছেন। এবং বাংলাদেশিদের মধ্যে এই বছর এই প্রবণতা আমরা লক্ষ্য করছি যে অনেকেই ট্রাম্পকে চাচ্ছেন। যেমন একজন ট্রাফিক এজেন্ট, নিউ ইয়র্ক সিটির পুলিশ বিভাগে কর্মরত, নিউ ইয়র্ক পুলিশের ট্রাফিক এজেন্ট, ওনাকে আমি প্রশ্ন করেছিলাম যে আপনি কি ভোট দিয়েছেন? বললেন যে না, দেইনি, কাজ শেষ করে তারপরে দিব। তো তখন সে বলল যে আমি ডেমোক্র্যাট, কিন্তু ট্রাম্প মন্দের ভালো। এরকম বিষয়গুলো এখন উঠে একটু বৈচিত্র্য এবারের ভোট কেন্দ্রে আমি লক্ষ্য করলাম। সকাল 6টা থেকে এই কেন্দ্রে ভোট গ্রহণ শুরু হয়েছে এবং চলবে রাত 9টা পর্যন্ত। তো যে কারণে প্রচুর সময় আছে এখন, তো অনেকেই ভোট দিতে আসবেন। এবং এবার যে স্বতঃস্ফূর্ততা, আমি নিজেই আগাম ভোট দিয়েছি এজ এ ডেমোক্রেট হিসাবে, কিন্তু আমি দেখেছি যে আগাম ভোটে এত উৎসাহ আমি আগে কখনো দেখিনি। তো আপনার যদি কিছু জানার থাকে আপনি আমাকে স্পেসিফিক প্রশ্ন করতে পারেন।
শাহিদুল ভাই, আপনি কি শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? আমাদেরকে শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
জি, শুনতে পাচ্ছি।
জি, শাহিদুল ভাই, আপনি যে you said something so interesting. আপনি বললেন you've spoken to a lot of voters, formerly democratic Bangladeshi voters who voted for Trump. এটার ব্যাপারে আর একটু বলবেন আমাদেরকে?
এবার আপনি জানেন যে নিউ ইয়র্ক সিটির বা স্টেটের, এটা তো আমরা বলি যে এটা ডেমোক্রেট স্টেট, কিন্তু এটার চেহারা কিন্তু আস্তে আস্তে বদলে যাচ্ছে। এখানে যে 24টা এবছর যে আসন আছে, কংগ্রেস আসন, তার ভিতরে একটি এখানে দুজন সিনেটর থাকেন, একজন এবার নির্বাচন করছেন, এবং আর কংগ্রেসের কয়েকটা পদে নির্বাচন হচ্ছে কয়েকটা আসনে। তো এইবারের চিত্রটা কেন জানি আমার মনে হচ্ছে যে নিউ ইয়র্ক সিটির চিত্রটা বদলে যেতে পারে নানা কারণে। নাগরিকদের, যারা ইমিগ্রান্ট, আমরা যারা বাংলাদেশিরা বা অন্যান্য কমিউনিটি, সবাই তো ইমিগ্রান্ট এখানে, সবার সুযোগ সুবিধাগুলো, যে নাগরিক সুবিধাগুলো, এগুলো দিন দিন বদলে যাচ্ছে। মেট্রোর ভাড়া বাড়ছে, তারপর জিনিসপত্রের যে দাম বাড়ছে, এসব নিয়ে মানে এক প্রকার ইমিগ্রেন্টরা হতাশ। তাদের জীবন ধারণ, বাড়ি ভাড়া বাড়ছে হু হু করে, এবং যে লিভিং কস্ট, এইটাও বেড়ে যাচ্ছে, এটা নিয়ন্ত্রণের বাইরে চলে যাচ্ছে। তো অনেকে মনে করে যে ট্রাম্পের যে 4 বছর তারা ভালো ছিল। ইভেন যারা বিশ্ব নিয়ে ভাবে, যুদ্ধ চায় না, তারাও দেখেছে যে ট্রাম্পের সময় কোনো যুদ্ধ হয়নি। যে কারণে এবার যারা ডেমোক্রেট, তারা হয়তো দল বদল করেনি, অনেকে আবার ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্ট হয়েছেন, কেউ রিপাবলিকান হয়েছেন, তারা হয়তো বলেননি, কিন্তু ভোটের রেজাল্টটা আমার কেন জানি মনে হচ্ছে যে এবার নিউ ইয়র্ক স্টেট থেকে বা এই যে নিউ ইয়র্ক সিটিতে একটা রেজাল্টে একটা তারতম্য আসতে পারে। ট্রাম্পের দিকে ঝুঁকছে মানুষ। আর একটা কারণ, আমি সিম্পল বাংলাদেশিদের প্রসঙ্গ টেনে স্পেসিফিকলি বলতে চাই যে এবার আমরা খেয়াল করেছেন যে 3-4 দিন আগে ট্রাম্প একটা টুইট করেছিলেন এক্সে, যে বাংলাদেশে সংখ্যালঘু নির্যাতন হচ্ছে। এরপরে যারা আওয়ামী লীগ সমর্থক, এখানে কিন্তু আছে বাংলাদেশে অনেক আওয়ামী লীগ সমর্থক আছেন, যারা যুক্তরাষ্ট্র আওয়ামী লীগের সাথে জড়িত, এবং একটা বড় দল হিসেবে এখানে তারা মিছিল, মিটিং এবং সরকার বিরোধী আন্দোলন বলেন, সরকারের পক্ষে আন্দোলন বলেন, খুব সক্রিয় ছিল। তারা কিন্তু তাদের মানে 99% তারা সিদ্ধান্ত বদলেছেন। যারা ডেমোক্রেট, তারা কিন্তু ট্রাম্পকে ভোট দিচ্ছেন। তারা চান, মনে করেন যে ট্রাম্প জিতলে তাদের পক্ষে কোনো একটা বিবৃতি বা কোনো একটা কার্যকর পদক্ষেপ ট্রাম্প নিবেন। এরকম ক্ষেত্রে অনেকে মত বদলাচ্ছেন। এবং একটা পরিবার স্বামী স্ত্রী, আমি যখন জিজ্ঞেস করলাম স্বামী ভোট দিয়েছেন ডেমোক্রেট হিসেবে আপনার মানে কমলা হ্যারিসকে, আবার নারী হয়েও মানে কমলা হ্যারিসকে ভোট দেননি, উনি বলতে চাননি, তারপর শেষে বলেছেন যে আমি এবার সিদ্ধান্ত বদলেছি। আবার আর একটা পরিবারে স্বামী স্ত্রী দুজন দুজনকে ভোট দিয়েছেন, মানে আলাদা করে ভোট দিয়েছেন। কেউ একজন দিয়েছেন, স্ত্রী দিয়েছেন কমলা হ্যারিসকে, বলেছেন উনি একজন নারী, উনি নারী হিসাবে যদি জিততে পারেন, নারীর অধিকার উনি আমাদেরকে সংরক্ষণ করবেন। কিন্তু আপনি জানেন যে 66 সালে এখানে নারী ভোট হয়েছে
Yes.
এবং হিলারি ক্লিনটন ব্যাপক জনপ্রিয়তার পরও কিন্তু হেরে গেছেন। তো এইবার যদি কমলা হ্যারিস কোনো ভালো রেজাল্ট করতে পারেন, প্রেসিডেন্ট হতে পারেন, তাহলে আমেরিকার ইতিহাসে তিনি হবেন সর্বপ্রথম আমেরিকান প্রেসিডেন্ট, যদিও উনি সর্বপ্রথম ভাইস প্রেসিডেন্ট।
Shardul Bhai, thank you so much for reporting from there. Thank you. I'm going to give you a quick summary. It's a very interesting thing. So it's like, of course, it's like a slice of life from like a certain part in an immigrant Bangladeshi neighborhood, where he said that a lot of people were just talking about how things were better during Trump's time, that they gave Biden 4 years. It just wasn't working out, that like they need something different. He talked about inflation. He said the cost of everything is way more than it used to be. And for that, a lot of Bangladeshis that he spoke to, and this is like, of course, a slice of life that he spoke to, were more interested in voting for Trump than not. Then he also talked about this interesting split, this interesting divide between basically men and women voting. He's like, he said he saw a bunch of couples going in to vote, and when they came out, he spoke to them, and he's like, the man was like, I voted for Trump, and the woman sometimes said she voted for Kamala Harris because she believes in having the first female president, and other times was kind of shy to respond to him, which he took to be actually maybe a vote for Kamala, but like within the same family, kind of splitting that vote. So it's an interesting observation. We're now going to go to somebody on the ground in Georgia. Jyot Singh, he is a political consultant and founder of Blue Husky Group, who spoke to us yesterday. Jyot, yesterday you said you'd come at us with some facts and figures. What have you got?
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just going back into the early vote here in Georgia, Georgia has relatively extended duration of early voting. I voted on October 15th. Today's November 5th, for example, right? That was the first day of early vote. So looking at the end of last week, the early vote numbers, again, these are trends, these are indicators, these are not definitive, but the percentage of the white vote has continued to drop in key bellwether and decider counties like here in Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County helped decide the presidential race for President Biden in 2020. It flipped in 2020 after, decades. And the percentage of women voting, the gender gap, I think you guys were just talking about this right now, it has increased. Right now, women in Gwinnett County, for example, hold a 12.5% advantage as of the end of last week. And it's very common, relatively very common, to see what you guys were just talking about, where within a family, we've been knocking on doors. Yesterday I was in a suit, today I'm in a t-shirt, we're knocking on doors, we're going to get back on the doors right after this. It is very common to see, you'll have the app, it'll say, husband, wife, kids, and all that, right? Household of 4 voters. And then you talk to the husband. He'll answer the door and he'll talk about voting for Trump. But then if the woman's there in the back, she'll shout in the background, no, I'm voting for Kamala. So it's a very, very common phenomenon we're seeing here in Georgia and nationwide. Again, with the API Victory Fund, we were in Michigan this past weekend. We were in Michigan for several past weekends. It's something we're seeing over there. It's something we're seeing in Asian households, in Desi households as well, where you have Kamala Devi Harris on top of the ticket, and she is drawing out the vote for South Asians, for Asians across the board, and especially South Asian women. So the trends are there. And I saw a report yesterday. It was on Twitter. I believe it was someone from the campaign. Right now, looking at early vote numbers in the key battleground states, Kamala Devi Harris is on track to win. But again, today is the big day. It is E-Day, it is D-Day, whatever you want to call it. So now we have to see what does turnout look like in the key precincts, in the key counties in each of these 7 battleground states. So it's an exciting day, but at least the energy is here, the momentum is here, and now we just have to finish strong.
Jyot, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. You talked about Desi households where the vote was split down the middle. Has this been a trend that you have known of since 2016, where maybe it's split down the middle, and I'm talking about now party over individual, where it was like a Republican, somebody in the household, in a Desi household, voting for one voting for Republican and one voting for a Democrat? Or is this a new trend you're seeing this time around?
You know, this has always been there historically, right? Especially when issues like reproductive rights, reproductive freedoms, are on the ballot, or are a hot topic. And I talked about this yesterday. It is the number one poll tested issue,
Yeah.
relatively across the board, right? So we've seen this phenomenon, for many cycles, but with Kamala Devi Harris on top of the ticket, it is definitely exacerbated in South Asian households. It is definitely even drawing men who have voted Republican and Trump even historically because of their fiscal policy priorities, right? And taxes and small businesses and things like that. And they may not care as much about the social issues, but we're seeing it across the board. You know, even down here in Georgia, we have Ashwin Ramaswamy running for state senate. I'm also a part of his team. And he is running in the one battleground state senate seat against an indicted election denier. The incumbent state senator is on trial alongside Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and other fake electors for trying to overthrow the 2020 election when Trump lost Georgia and Trump commanded his MAGA extremists to overthrow the election. So we have Ashwin trying to be the first also Indian in the Georgia state legislature. And Ashwin is drawing a variety of voters. He's drawing those Republican Indian uncles and aunties and families and youth as well to vote for him. And then you have Kamala at the top of the ticket as well. So it's across the board. We're seeing this a split ticket, split household vote exacerbated, but Kamala's even getting those Indian uncles and aunties and fathers and uncles, right, to vote for her as well because of the grand historic candidacy she represents. And then you have down ballot folks here in Georgia as well. Again, we talked about State Senator Nabila Islam, who represents Gwinnett County. We have State Senator Sheikh Rahman, who's Bangladeshi down here as well, right? And then you have Ashwin running to be, the first Indian Georgia state legislature as well. So we're really seeing a unique phenomenon here in Georgia, where you have this slate of candidates that really looks like the county. It really looks like Johns Creek, where Ashwin lives. It really looks like the state of Georgia more and more.
It's so interesting that you'd say that. And you talked about these two the Bangladeshi people, candidates of Bangladeshi origin. Could you tell me how their election is going today? Any news, any updates
State
on
Senator
that?
Sheikh Rahman, he's been around for a few terms. He's a community leader down here, especially for Bangladeshi Americans.
Yeah.
He's good. He is in a safe seat. He is not targeted. State Senator Nabila Islam was the one state senate seat that Governor Brian Kemp and the GOP down here in Georgia did want to target. But we've been running an incredible campaign. We're feeling good about her race, and she was the first Bangladeshi woman down here in Georgia to be elected in the Georgia state legislature. And I also believe the first Bangladeshi state woman, or one of two in 2022 elected nationwide at this level. But no, we're feeling good about our race. The governor and the GOP have not really come after her, actually, because we looked at the numbers, we looked at the poll, and like I mentioned, the voter turnout in her district is one of the highest, if not the highest, in Gwinnett County and statewide.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the update from Georgia. Thank you for the update from our Bangladeshi American candidates over there. And one last question before we go. Can you call it? Can you tell us where's Georgia going to go?
I think Georgia's going to stay blue. You heard it here first.
Okay, I heard it there first. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, folks, Georgia's going blue. How do you feel about that?
I think what we just heard from both our guests, I feel like it validates my gut feeling about that. What I heard about people switching their votes to last minute to Trump in Queens, that makes me feel like people are a little bit lacking enthusiasm for the Democratic last 4 years of the Democrats. And in terms of what we're hearing in Georgia, it's white votes dropping. It feels like there's also a lack of enthusiasm for the Trump vote, in my opinion.
Okay.
It feels like it makes sense.
Interesting. Saran? Any thoughts on Georgia? Any thoughts on how we got a little slice of what it looks like, of what now very of how Georgia might go? I think slightly biased opinion potentially. Do you see maybe Georgia, maybe Pennsylvania, maybe Michigan, all going Kamala Harris's way, the night ending blue?
I want to be honest, I have no idea.
Okay.
I have hopes.
Yes, yeah.
But I cannot offer much more than a hope.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, Assemblymember Mamdani, you have been one of the most vocal U.S. politicians to speak out about Gaza. It has made you incredibly popular. And it's also made you incredibly unpopular as well. And I ask this question specifically in New York City, multiracial, multi-ethnic, but like people have values across the spectrum over here as well. Do you think your outspoken vocal support for Palestine, do you think it'll hamper your mayoral campaign?
I think it actually helps my mayoral campaign. There is no doubt that there are New Yorkers who disagree with my position on extending human rights to Palestinians and all of the universal tenets that we believe in to Palestinians and to all people. But there are actually far more New Yorkers who agree with that kind of politics and haven't found an avenue for them to express that. And I'll tell you, we launched this campaign less than 2 weeks ago. And on the first day, we were endorsed by 5 different organizations. And one of those organizations represents thousands of Jewish New Yorkers across New York City. And this was the first ever municipal campaign that they had endorsed. And I think that's indicative of the fact that a lot of analyses about the political landscape of New York City are analyses that have been built many decades ago.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity to showcase that this city actually has far more viewpoints on a whole set of different issues, whether it be electing a socialist mayor or whether it be standing up for Palestinian human rights, than the political class has given it credit for.
Sure. Maher, the use of the word genocide by a mainstream politician, we're going to speak about Zohran without speaking to him exactly, is very unusual over here. And the fact that it's resonated so far, in your understanding of American politics, can more people now come out and say genocide? Can larger numbers of people say it, and for a stigma not to be attached to it?
So I have to be careful here because I work for a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization.
Yeah.
It reminds me a lot of, the navigating, reporting this issue. It reminds me a lot of coverage of the Rohingya genocide in 2017, 2018. And I remember one thing that happened in that scenario was someone who worked for the UN kind of came out and by mistake, not so much by mistake, but really without getting, going up the chain of command, accidentally came out and called it a genocide, or called it ethnic cleansing, actually, I believe. And I think that really gave journalists a lot of leeway to start using such terms. So in that kind of sense, seeing people come out and be quite outspoken about what's going on in Gaza, I think that shifts what is acceptable language, right? What is acceptable language to use, for sure. At the same time, I'm not so sure that that the issue that the issue will hinge necessarily on whether or not that word is something we can use, because or reactions to what's going on there is going to hinge so much on whether or not that word is something we can use, because I'm fairly cynical, and I think at the end of the day a lot of people are okay with whatever you call something. If they decide they want to do it, they can do it.
That's a stark and very human take, actually, at the same time.
If I could just offer something on that, I think we also have to acknowledge that it is the correct application of the term. It's not just reflective of political sentiment and sympathy. Genocide is a crime of intent, it's a crime of execution, and we have found that with the statements and the policies that have been put forward by the Israeli government from the very beginning of this, and then the application of those statements of the consideration of Palestinians as human animals, and the killing of more than 40,000 Palestinians, a number which we know to be a vast underreporting. It is the most important thing in this moment, I think, similar to what you were saying, although I know you were in a nonprofit newsroom, and there are limitations to what you can say, is not the naming of it, but rather the ending of it. Oh. And I think that is what Americans want to see. And it is something that I think actually is a concern that is woven through a lot of the coverage of this election and how Americans are feeling about this election, is they are tired of despair.
If I can actually add a little bit to that, I don't think your instinct on that is wrong either. I wonder myself, how is this war going over among Republican voters? I'm not so sure that even that demographic is uniform in how it approaches this war. So, yeah, I think it's quite up in the air how
Yeah.
voters react to this and shift on this.
We have a few minutes left with Assemblymember Mamdani, and I've got two questions for you. I saw your campaign ad, fantastic ad, running through it. My knee felt bad just looking at the video. Don't know how many takes you took. The ad was great. The ad also name-checked two people. Very obviously it name-checked the current mayor of New York City, Mayor Adams, Eric Adams. It also name-checked Andrew Cuomo. Why was that?
Well, they are both disgraced New York executives. One is current, the other is former.
Yeah.
And they both have aspirations to be the mayor of New York City from 2026.
Is this something you know for a fact?
They absolutely have aspirations.
That Governor Cuomo has aspirations for mayor?
I know it for a fact that he has aspirations,
Okay,
and
yeah.
he is interested in running.
Yeah.
He is taking the preparatory steps to doing so.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make clear in that ad and throughout this campaign
Yeah.
that New Yorkers have no interest
Yeah.
in the return of Andrew Cuomo because they have no interest in the return of an executive
Mm-hmm.
who was responsible for one of the deepest mismanagements of COVID across this country
Yeah.
at a state level, and who was also interested far more in cutting basic services for New Yorkers, no matter where they experienced them, than he was in delivering those kinds of services. And on the issue that we've just spoken about with regards to Palestine and Palestinian human rights, it is hard to find someone who seems to be on the right of Eric Adams when it comes to Palestine in the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
and yet Andrew Cuomo seems to offer that alternative.
Okay. I'm going to end with one last question. Last week at Madison Square Garden, Donald Trump said, and I'm going to quote him, you know who I want to thank? Mayor Adams. Because Mayor Adams has been treated very badly. He went on to say, I have to tell you, he's been really great. What do you think of Donald Trump thanking Mayor Adams, saying that he's been treated really badly? Has Mayor Adams been treated really badly?
No, Mayor Adams has not been treated badly, but Mayor Adams has been treated fairly. And that is what offends Donald Trump, and that's what offends Eric Adams. Because the two of them share one thing in common, which is impunity. They both believe that that is their right. And Donald Trump sees someone in Eric Adams, and that someone is himself. And what we deserve is a mayor of New York City who, when offered the chance to denounce the former president's plan to enact the largest deportation program in American history, would denounce it, instead of the one that we have, who refused to take that very question because he views his future as tied up with the political fortunes of a fascist.
It's interesting that I think we have to end on that over here because I think your time with us is done. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you also for letting us know that, folks, Andrew Cuomo is running for mayor. It hasn't been announced, but we know it for a fact right now. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. I know you have campaign stops, you have work to do, and I think we're going to move on to our next guest.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And now we have, and we're going to bring in, and now joining us next is Shahana Hanif. Shahana is the first Muslim woman elected to the New York City Council and currently represents District 39. Shahana, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Shahana, election day, you must have been out and about, maybe speaking to some constituents, walking around the neighborhood. What have you seen? What are your thoughts?
I have seen tremendous energy, excitement. I've been visiting polling sites in my district since 6 a.m. I represent neighborhoods including Park Slope, Kensington, Carroll Gardens. So it's a big stretch of communities. Many of my constituents have voted early, which is really encouraging. And for those who are watching us live, if you haven't voted, please go out and vote. You have until 9 p.m. today.
Yeah. And Shahana, you're saying what you're seeing is, are you seeing a lot of enthusiasm, or are you seeing people going out to vote feeling like they don't have a lot of great options in front of them? Because we spoke to one of our correspondents earlier from Queens, and it seemed to be the vibe that he presented to us. The people he spoke to over there was like a split tickets between families, and people were going out to vote not because they were necessarily happy about a candidate, but because they were upset with where they were in life right now, with inflationary costs, with other issues, saying things were better in 2016. So are you seeing a lot of enthusiasm for any candidates, or is it Or is it something else?
I'm absolutely seeing enthusiasm for a candidate. And to your point, I mean, the diversity of our New York City voters is warranted. We live in a democracy, and we need that kind of debate and discourse around what's working for us, what's not working for us. Now, we are up against a fascist. We are up against a candidate, former President Trump, who will ban abortion protections. We've already repealed Roe v. Wade. And right now in the New York City ballot, or actually New York wide, we're voting on Proposition 1 that would enshrine abortion protections within our state constitution. So there's a lot at stake here. And I know that what I've heard from also many of my constituents who are certainly disillusioned. They feel disillusioned. They feel that their fight over the last year advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza, an arms embargo on Israel, and a release of all the hostages has not been met with integrity. People feel that their government is letting them down. However, that fight will continue. There's no reason to associate, in my opinion, what happens tonight or whenever we find the results, that's the end of our fight. We have to continue fighting. The federal government does not dictate everything that happens at the local level, which is why we're also encouraging our residents to vote on the Democratic Party line down ballot, because we have some competitive races in the state, in the assembly. This is a large package deal for us. So we must ensure that what happens tonight is just a piece of the puzzle. It is not the whole puzzle. It is not the solution. It's not the revolution, but it's the urgency. It's the urgency to act. I deeply believe in a country that can be built on compassion and dignity. And as a council member, I hold that value very deeply. And it is my responsibility as a leader in our city. And as you mentioned, the first Muslim, first South Asian woman in the city council, and in my district, the first woman, that it is imperative that we listen to the leaders on the ground and hear out what are the repercussions if we vote in a Trump for a second term.
Shahana, you spoke about Gaza, and then you also spoke about how this is not the end of the fight, right? But then you also spoke about the great enthusiasm for voting. So I'm trying to square the circle over here. There's great enthusiasm for voting for potentially a Democrat. And then after you vote for them, the fight still continues. Help me understand why we should vote for someone, why people should vote for a candidate, and then still have to fight them on the big moral issue of our moment. I don't fully understand that, but I'd like to hear that from you, though.
Yeah, no, totally. And look, electoral participation and civic engagement through voting is one tool that we are lucky to have in our democracy. We get to vote and we get to exercise that power in a high stakes election like today. However, this doesn't mean that there isn't a spectrum of voters who feel that the Democratic Party is not going enough. Like, for example, and I saw that my colleague, Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani, was on, we identify as democratic socialists. We are on the far left of the Democratic Party. We are not conservative moderates, and we are not on the right agenda, which could be compared to what Mayor Adams has demonstrated to New Yorkers. So it is incumbent on us to be civically engaged, because decisions are getting made for us. And if we do not respond, and if we do not react, that essentially withdraws the power that one has around their voice, and allows governments, all levels of government, to decide what happens to you, what happens to your child, what happens to your housing, what happens to your immigrant family. I mean, a lot is at stake, and we have to understand that there have always been this cycle of movement building and organizing happening to yearn for a better country. And side by side, we recognize that movements from the ground up have helped inform policies and decisions that do get made at the very local level, state and federal level. So what we're doing is imperative, because I also, think about if the leadership, the crop of Muslim leadership that now exists. This is I would say, like, over the last couple of years, we have seen Muslim electeds in office. This is the first of its kind. And so we have been the most outspoken for a ceasefire since the very beginning following the tragedy. And I think about, if we weren't there, if we did not elect representatives that do represent values aligned with peace and justice for all, not just some, who would have stood up, and how long would it have taken? So this is all important, and it is because the stakes are so high, in that decisions get made for you, policy gets made for you, money, where money is going gets decided for you. We have to recognize that we need to be active participants. We can't be in the background. We can't say, they did nothing for me, so I'm gonna take a back seat. That full apathy grants more power to your government to do what they want.
Sure. And what you've described is also the power of smaller elections. We always think about the tip of the spear being the presidential election. What are important is getting Muslims, people of color, people of every different faith elected around different smaller districts, around local elections. We often think about what's that thing they say? Make sure you vote for your local dog catcher, right? And I think there is power in that. But in this moment, on a day like today, it does seem like the options that people have to choose from at the top of the ticket, which define lives and actually how tax dollars are used to bomb children and women in Palestine. I feel like when you put it up in such a stark way, I understand why why many people say my civic duty today is to not vote for a party, and I mean both parties, to not vote for one of these parties where I will continue to have to fight them after they are elected. And I wonder, we don't have much time over here. How would you respond to that? And I will say cynicism, because I think cynicism might be one of the defining factors of today's presidential vote, if not for other elected offices. You've got a minute for us, please.
First, I just want to, react. I don't think you should be as pessimistic about this. The fact that we have options, and the fact that we have the privilege to say, I'm not going to vote,
but you say I shouldn't be this pessimistic.
Is the essential principle of democracy. However, I'm not. How someone votes is not what I'm going to judge.
Sure.
I have made recommendations. I am supporting the Harris-Walz ticket. I visited Pennsylvania last weekend. I was in Chester, Pennsylvania. This town is, the unemployment rate is so high. There are toxics that have created illness and health issues, which was once a industrial hub. There is no hospital security. There is massive disinvestment from schools. So in New York City, we get to see what privilege in one sense looks like. And then you go to somewhere like Chester, where they are going to decide how this vote turns out. And you recognize that there are parts of our country that need our attention and need leadership. And I believe that Trump is not that leadership.
Sure.
And that that the Democratic Party also has leaders like me and Zohran.
Absolutely.
I mean, we need to make sure that we're building up from the ground up of what the leaders of tomorrow's Democratic Party look like.
Shahana, thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating and illuminating conversation. Best of luck, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you. And now joining us in the studio is Harry Siegel. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Columnist for the New York Daily News, a senior editor at The City, and also the founding member of the Flaming Hydra newsletter collective. Love that name. And a contributing writer for the magazine Vital City. He also hosts the podcast FAQ New York City, NYC. Check out that podcast. Harry, thank you for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Harry. We just heard, I think we heard something which I both agree with on a personal level, and I also kind of disagree with, where it's just like we're being asked in this election to go out and vote, and then we're also being told, but the fight never stops. What are your thoughts about that?
It's an election. Things build up.
Yeah.
They start feeling apocalyptic.
Yeah.
It's the most important election ever.
But it always is. We're always told this is the most important, this is the most consequential election. When will I not hear that? When will it not be that?
When we don't have elections, I suspect. But things have reached a certain fever pitch, and on a lot of issues, there's tremendous space between the parties and the candidates and what they're offering, and very different visions for the country. And then, of course, with what happens in Congress, and New Yorkers, are really worked up about this, even as they have very little say. There's basically no competitive congressional races here. We know where our electoral votes are going, the states. And that's a strange and sort of frustrating moment. So we'll know a lot more soon, but to your question, these are tremendous moments because we get to weigh in every 4 years and then every 2 years in congressional races, and this really does decide the path of the country, where resources are going to be allocated, and all that. And on some of these issues, as you're saying, for instance, with Israel and the Palestinians, there's questions about what the distinction between the parties would be and how that matters. And democratic socialists, like a couple of your guests in New York, and many other people feel really passionately about this, and that this is, as I think Zoran said, the defining moral issue of our day. I point out that they've not managed to convince the broader electorate of that. That's not the terms the national debate is playing out in at all. And in fact, I think there's some case to be made that a Trump win could have something to do with the skepticism about how protests have played out, about how this is the issue because of which we need to shut down everything. And to go back to one of the things Zoran was saying, he said calling it genocide or not is not the most important thing. I don't want to get outside of our frame and talk about the meaning of the term, but I will say that I think calling it genocide and saying this is the thing, we need to stop the city, stop the university from functioning, we're not going to have business as usual, is something that is very much part of Trump's appeal. And these people want to shut things down, they want to have a veto over the government, and we're the party that can stop that. That he wants a backdrop of chaos, we know, as he's running.
Interesting. I'm going to change tack actually quite a lot, because there's something that I think is so interesting. Every 4 years, we talk about this idea of the undecided voter. Maher, as somebody who's been out in the field last time around, I'm not sure about this time, having spoken to so many people, can you help us understand what defines the undecided voter?
You will be surprised to hear me say they're not a monolith.
Yeah.
I feel like they exist. I know that every few years we're like, how can you at this point, the parties have such different stances, how can you at this point be undecided? But they exist, and they're undecided. My experience talking to voters is that the ones that I've come across where they're, some voters say, oh, both choices, I just feel both choices are bad. Or some voters say, I like this about this person, or I like, something else about the other candidate. I feel like their reasons are often quite varied. A lot of people are not, I think there is, while the two-party stances can seem very different, I think there is good reason for different voters who are in different places, in different circumstances in their lives and in the country, and in the different places in the economy, to be asking themselves, is a Democratic administration better for me, or is a Republican administration better for me, right? You have enough people out there who I think can ask themselves, okay, is inflation going to be worse for me under a Democratic administration, or is inflation going to be worse for me under a Republican administration? Is taxation going to be worse for me? Are immigration policies, how are they going to be affecting me? I think those are genuinely good things for people to be unsure about for certain demographics, right? Certain voter demographics, I can see why they would not be 100% sure. There are business owners, right, who can kind of think that Trump will be good for me, right? Yeah. But then they can also think that maybe Trump will bring about an economic collapse, which would be bad for me, right? You can have people.
And in your experience, these people, they are actually undecided until they enter that booth, or it's like, well, what is it that? I'm not saying you can be inside their mind, but I'm actually trying to understand this stat, this thing that we talk about all the time. It's so difficult to pin down. Of course, they're not a monolith. Of course, they're not. But how, until election day, can they be such a large portion of the people who are deciding in that moment? Because then, I guess the question comes: are they undecided, or are they potentially single issue or two issue voters? Harry, could you, I'd like to, is it undecided, or are you just a single issue voter?
So some of the most basic terms don't actually make sense. So undecided voters, a lot of them are deciding whether or not they're going to vote. And the weather might have something to do with that. You have people who feel fear and loathing for both sides in different ways, can envision different apocalypses, or just sort of interested, sort of not, or starting to pay attention late, or whatever. And so all of us, as we're talking about this, thinking about it, fretting about where things are going, are thinking about this one way. And that's sort of like a sports event. And that's also looking at the polls and these other parts, and are those still accurate? But then for the political pros, it's just a question of, are we going to win this state? Are we going to win these electoral votes? Can we get out another couple hundred people that might make that marginal difference? And some of that are people who are genuinely, I don't know which of these evils, which of these poisons I want to swallow. And a lot of that is are they going to show up? Are they going to participate? And working to make that happen. And it's not the healthiest thing for a democracy in a country of, 300 million people to be talking about pockets of, as Trump did after 2020, it's 7,000 votes in Georgia. Right, and if that happens, I have all the power, and if it doesn't, I don't. But that is how this system is built. So I think we're all sort of staring at them, and then if things don't go the way people expect, like in 2016, it's like, well, who's the person in the diner mumbling a bunch of stuff, or ranting, we didn't listen to, and that gets over-indexed. But the stakes are so incredibly high that these sometimes marginal and unlikely people who often don't have fully developed views and are just thinking like, I'd like to have this check. I'd like to not have my tips taxed or whatever. Am I going to show up? They're of critical importance at this moment and at this juncture. And then we're going to have a path that's set depending on who turns out and how and where that leaves the country.
It's interesting that you talk about like the tips. That is part of, actually, I went and read all 16 pages, double spaced, lots of caps. I went and read Trump's plan for his vision for America, right? And tips being taxed, taking that away, that was one of the 20 points. It was a prominent point. It wasn't a point by itself. It was added to a different point. But it speaks to like the type of person who he is trying to speak to is a person who works a job where they are paid, where part of their wage comes from tips. And I think that's interesting as well. When I scrolled up the document, I've forgotten what it's called, but the document, it's actually dedicated to the forgotten men and women of America. I found that to be interesting, and I was wondering who are the forgotten men and women of America that this document, this plan that he has, who are they? Who is he speaking to with this document?
I'll let you take this first.
Yeah.
Please.
People without college degrees, mostly, who are finding it harder to work out livings without credentials in a bunch of different ways. And so that's people who are doing physical work, service work, where you have to show up in person, who really felt the impact, for instance, of COVID restrictions in ways that like an office class person like myself did not. But I think that's broadly, in this moment of real transformation for how our political alliances are formed, like who he's trying to send those signals to, and also obviously to men, as we have a vastly unprecedented gender gap between the party and a lot of guys. And as a guy with daughters, right, I think about this stuff and like the things I never had to think about. Like, I was a weird, smelly 13-year-old and it was fine. And my daughter is a lot like me. My older one is, it's different.
Yeah.
When she's weird in her own ways, and how that manifests in the world. But I think the real wages haven't gone up since 1980, basically, standard of living wise, and there's lots of people who feel frustrated, and then when they're told, no, the numbers show things are good, they're angry about it and willing to countenance more radical alternatives. And I think Trump has been savvy trying to connect with some of those groups.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, for example, I think you have messaging from Trump that is quite strong in terms of pithy, simple economic messaging. Harris, high taxes; Trump, low taxes, right? Things like that. And I think that is something where the electorate in the U.S. The campaigning, this elections, like election seasons in the U.S., I feel like they don't always do a great job of placing the economy in context, right? So, for example, you could probably make a good case that a lot of the economic difficulties and probably some of the political difficulties that have been faced by the Biden-Harris administration have had a lot to do with the legacy of the Trump administration, right? And that's really a case of controlling the narrative, or not controlling the narrative, but shaping the narrative, right? And I think what Harry said here, I agree with completely, which is you're going to people who are maybe selling their car, right? Considering selling their car. Maybe they're, not thinking about buying the house, right? A lot of people feel that they can't afford to buy their own house these days. You go to people and you tell them that the economy is doing good. Look, the inflation number is falling, but your groceries are still expensive. It's very poor messaging.
Yeah, so the forgotten men and women of America that Trump's trying to address. It seems like people who have not had it great, and they need somebody to blame for the situation they're in. It does feel like blame needs to be assigned to someone. And I'm not saying which way it should go, but it does feel like that a little bit. Like I
have a slightly,
we're going to make this quick because we need to jump into our next guest. But
I think there's this aspect of it where life has thrived for certain sections of the population in America, and life has not thrived for certain sections of the population in America. I do think it's important to contextualize a little that America is the richest country in the world.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about people who are struggling in America, there's still an aspect of it where a lot of the fear about economic decline has a lot to do with a loss of status, as opposed to the same struggles that you see in a lot of other countries.
That's a fantastic point. And with that, we're going to move into our next guest. We have Kevin. Let's see if we've got Kevin over here joining us now from Kevin McCurry. Thank you for joining us again. Kevin is an executive producer and host at WHYY, overseeing Philadelphia's NPR station's live news talk show. He's covered and edited politics in Pennsylvania for years at WHYY, as well as other outlets in leadership roles. I've been told I see you're out and about. I've been told our sound might not be good, but can you hear me?
I can hear you wonderfully. Good afternoon.
Perfect. Good afternoon. Kevin, give us...
So yeah, you might be able to see behind me.
Yes.
I'm right in front of Independence Hall here in Philadelphia, which in 1776 is where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So Pennsylvania is the political universe center right now, and here we are in the middle of the cradle of democracy.
And Kevin, you've been out, you've been talking to people. What are you hearing from them? What's happening on the ground?
Yeah, I was at a few polling places this morning, and it was very interesting. The first one I went to was a district that Biden won handily in 2020, and I would say that there were more Harris voters out there, but there was a good mix of different people. And so, for instance, a Harris voter who I talked to, retired teacher, said, she was out for women's rights, for abortion, some of those kind of classic issues we know that Democrats often or always vote for. Another Democratic voter there, talked just about preserving the democracy, etc. One Trump voter who I talked to was interesting, who basically said, look, I look at the policies, I don't look at the personality. You might not like Trump, but I like what he stands for. And he was there voting with his girlfriend. And I said, oh, can I talk to you too? And she said, I don't want to talk. I don't want to have my picture taken. And I said, well, can you tell me who you voted for? And she said, oh, I'm not going to say it out loud. And he kind of joked and said, well, yeah, there's some disagreement in the House. And that's something I think that could be a narrative in this election, the gender gap, right? And you have husbands and wives or boyfriends and girlfriends kind of splitting their tickets, and how much of that will happen and how much will happen kind of on the margins differently than it did in past election cycles, and could that tip things? So that was an interesting dynamic. Then I went to another district that was kind of classically decades ago would have been much more Republican in the suburbs, but over time has become more Democrat. Yet in 2016, it's a place that Trump won. In 2020, it's a place that Biden won. So I went there very specifically trying to understand, how are these more swing voters who maybe are on the fence, what are they thinking about? What are they doing? And I did find a young woman, 30 years old, who told me she voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, voted for Biden in 2020, and this is the first year she's voting for Donald Trump. And why? What was the rationale? Economy. I'm a mom of two. I feel like I work hard. I pay my taxes, and I feel like Donald Trump was the person who is going to get me more out of the economy than Kamala Harris. And we talked about, okay, has that sparked any discord among you and your friends, your family? She said, not my family, but my friend group. Yes, I've learned to just not talk about politics. So that's an interesting voter right there who went for Biden in 2020, was part of this suburban voter for Biden that helped him carry Pennsylvania. Well, at least there's one person that the Biden campaign has lost. Now, of course, I talked to other people at that same polling place who have been strong for Harris and cited a lot of, reasons that Democrats often say for why they're voting for Harris again this year. So 2 places I've been to so far, I've seen, a mixed vote. It's really hard to tell right now which way things are leaning. We've seen anecdotally, I think, strong turnout so far for Pennsylvania. The lines have been long. The people have been kind of enthusiastic to get out there and vote. It's just really hard to say anything concrete based in data at this point, but we will be continually talking to people all day and following the results.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight, because it's actually, it dovetails very well. We spoke to our correspondent on the ground in Queens here in New York. And he said he went and spoke to a bunch of Bangladeshi Americans, spoke to a number of them. And a number of these couples who were voting together, it was a split ticket. And just like the story, just like almost word for word the story that you were saying to us, they said he asked the man in the couple, who did you vote for? This Bangladeshi American said, I voted for Trump, and then asking the lady with him, she generally like a little hesitant to say it, and then when she does say it, it turns out she said she wanted to vote for the first female president. But first of all, the hesitancy to even say that, which was like a interesting and very odd and very peculiar dynamic, right? It's troubling, I'll say it, troubling dynamic of feeling like you can't actually say who you're voting for. But the fact that so many households, and I'm hearing it across states. And when we spoke to our correspondent in Georgia as well, the person we spoke to about 40 minutes before you, he said the same thing. They went canvassing today. They went door to door today. They were speaking to people. He opens it up. He went and spoke to a number of Desi households, a number of South Asian households, where the man voted for Trump and the woman voted for Kamala. This idea that it could not boil down, it won't ever boil down to any one topic, but this could be the defining way to view and engage with this election a week from now when it's over our shoulder. It's really fascinating to me. And I guess my question to you is, in Pennsylvania, by any chance, would you happen to know, historically, has the vote been split pretty evenly between the male vote and the female vote? And do you think this time we're going to see kind of a massive shift?
I think that the abortion issue did change a lot in Pennsylvania. In 2022 specifically, right after the Dobbs decision happened, which overturned Roe v. Wade, we had a governor's election. And you could argue that, who was going to be the governor? Was it going to be the very pro-life, anti-abortion access Republican, or the pro-choice, pro-abortion access Democrat? That was on the ballot then.
Sure.
And the Democrat won handily. And you saw women come out, especially in the suburbs, for Democrats in that election, unlike you had seen before. And the big question is that same pattern going to hold in this election, where you can argue because we have a Democratic governor, there's not going to be any drastic change in the state law in terms of what abortion rights are in Pennsylvania. So whether Trump's elected or Kamala's elected, the abortion rights in Pennsylvania are likely to stay the same, at least until several cycles from now in state races.
Mm-hmm.
So does that soften the vote, if that maybe women don't have the same enthusiasm as they had, or abortion voters don't have that same enthusiasm that they had in 2022? We will see. But yeah, in past cycles, you did see, I think, more parity between men and women. And the Trump effect has just done something different to the gender dynamic. The genders clearly respond to him in very different ways. And in the relationship that I cited earlier, the two voters who I spoke to, I don't think they even talk about it. That was the gist I got. It wasn't like, it's some thing that like we're mad at each other about. It was just something that they just put aside. We have our relationship, and then we have who we vote for. And somehow they're able to compartmentalize that in their personal life, and it works for them. Great. But at least that was the dynamic that I saw today.
It is interesting, this dynamic of maybe within households as well, just like not talking about it, a vote being a private act, right? You go out there, you vote, you see what happens at the end of the day. You are speaking from the heavily Democratic area of Philadelphia, am I right?
Yes, that's right.
The surrounding counties, are they as Democratic as Philadelphia? Democratic leaning?
So that's what's changed in the course of the past, say, 2 decades. It used to be that Philadelphia was very, very blue, and the suburbs were more red. And then other parts of Pennsylvania that had more of like working class union type jobs were also Democratic. Now, what's changed is the suburbs around Philadelphia have become much more Democratic, and those rural areas that used to be more Democratic have become way more Republican. So the state is still like a bellwether state where every election you kind of don't know which way it's going to go, but the reasons for that have fundamentally changed. And a lot of it breaks down around college degree, right? If you find people who have college degrees, especially in the suburbs, you're guessing that they're going to vote for Democrats.
Yeah.
And if you find people who don't have college degrees, especially in rural areas, you're guessing with high predictability that they're going to vote Republican or for Trump. And Trump's messaging to the working class of the state has worked. And I think that's something that Democrats continue to reflect on. How can we still be a party that represents the working people? And I think it's something that they're figuring out. There's a Senate candidate who won as a Democrat in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, who kind of has been, I would say, a leading voice for Democrats on this issue. Having been the mayor of a small rural town, in it basically a steel mill town, he has tried to reflect the fact that here's why Trump's talking points work for this group of people. Here's what we as Democrats need to do better in messaging to them. And it's interesting. We'll see whether or not that will work or not. And I think what at the end of the day, Kamala Harris's campaign is banking on is continually driving up the vote in the suburbs, not ceding more ground in the rural areas, and holding on to the core urban vote that has been there for Democrats for a long time. And vice versa, Donald Trump is saying, if I can just win back some of those voters who voted for me the first time in 2016, who then went to Biden, if I can win some of those back while also talking to, more men who are disaffected with the Democratic Party, who might be Latino or Black, who traditionally have voted for Democrats, but find something resonant in Trump's message. He can win enough of those. Can he flip the state red? He's banking, yes. Kamala's banking that she can do the same. So here we are. Polls will close at 8 o'clock tonight in Pennsylvania, and we're just going to have to wait and see.
Before we get to, let's say, when polls close at 8, but how soon can we know the first? When do you think we'll know which way Pennsylvania's gone? What time tonight?
So, yeah, the counties are not allowed to count any of the votes that come in early until election. They have to just basically stay there and wait. And then as soon as polls open on election day, they can begin to count all those mail ballots.
Yeah.
They're not going to report any of that information until polls close at 8 o'clock. So at 8 o'clock, we will see a flood of results come in. And that is the results from the mail ballots.
Okay.
And we know based on just how the numbers and the registration goes for who has requested mail ballots, that vote is going to lean Democrat.
Yeah.
It's going to maybe lean less Democrat than it did in past cycles because the GOP has made more effort to say you should go out and vote by mail. Okay, so we're going to see that early batch. And then after that, it's going to be county by county. As they count votes, they're going to be coming in through the evening. Now, last time around, we didn't have clarity for days after the election. Analysts think it's going to happen faster this year. Does that mean we're going to know tonight? Does it mean tomorrow?
What's
Does it mean
changed?
the day after? That's still unclear.
Kevin, help me
I
out.
think there's definitely a world where we could know something definitively tonight or tomorrow.
Kevin, help me out. What's changed between 2020 and 2024 that it looks like it's still going to be a very close election, but why would we potentially know so much earlier this year? I'm actually just curious about this.
Well, part of it is the fact that we know that fewer people will vote by mail this year than they voted by mail in 2020, right? That was a pandemic year where, for many reasons, people who normally don't vote by mail were voting by mail. Mm-hmm. And just given the logistical, legal rules that I laid out before about how those ballots can be counted and when they can be counted, it put a tremendous burden on the counties to do those counts by the book.
Fair. Thank you.
So if there are fewer mail ballots, that in theory makes it
quicker,
faster.
It makes it quicker.
And then at the same time, all those election officials have just gotten that much better with 4 years more experience in how they can streamline the process.
And
so between those two factors, we do think that we'll have an answer sooner this year.
And I just got just one or two more questions. I'm gonna leave you. You've been holding your phone for so long, but like I am gonna say, if the Democrats, if they end up losing Pennsylvania, will they regret not picking Governor Shapiro as the vice presidential candidate? What do you think?
I think that there would be a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking on that.
Sure.
Oh, am I still here?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think there would be a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking on that, and I think that certainly would be a storyline that will resonate with some people. We have a popular incumbent governor who is seen as a uniter. You talk to Republican voters who are going to vote for Trump today, and they'll say, "I like that Josh Shapiro. I like that guy. I like what he did." Of course, the issue of Israel-Palestine has been, very, divisive. And so that was one of the narratives out there for why Kamala didn't pick Josh Shapiro to be her running mate. You talk to insiders and analysts and they say, okay, that could have been a factor. What maybe was a bigger factor is everybody who knows Josh Shapiro and who knows Pennsylvania politics knows that he is a very ambitious person who is not used to playing the role of number two. He's a number one.
That's a really interesting take.
Something just in their conversation where Kamala, didn't want somebody who might be just naturally have the political power to upstage her, right? These are all the narratives that went into that conversation. Now, to your point, if she loses Pennsylvania, there will be plenty of people who say, if Josh was on the ticket, that would have given more people confidence to vote for the Harris Shapiro ticket, and that would have made a difference. But it's all hearsay.
It's all hearsay. Kevin, thank you so much for being with us. And I guess we'll find out soon enough. Thank you. Let's move back into the panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
We heard a lot about, first of all, I learned something fantastic about why Pennsylvania took so long. Because I know last time Pennsylvania had 2.5 million mail-in ballots. So that's why it took so long for them to finally get them counted and for Pennsylvania to be announced. This year it's going to be far less. But like Pennsylvania seems to be one of those states. I know we're sitting here in New York, but I think it's important because it feels like everything does seem to hinge a little bit around Pennsylvania. Like it seems to be like a winner-take-all situation. However else the chips fall for other states, Pennsylvania, the winner of Pennsylvania becomes president. Any thoughts on where you think Pennsylvania is going? It's been close to 2 election cycles in a row. Last time, President Biden won it by, 1.7%, 80,000 votes or something like that. It was a very small number. Do you have a feel for what might happen this time?
It's been very interesting with Pennsylvania. I feel like there's been this shift in a lot of other states that you would think of as similar to Pennsylvania, blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin. They've trended more Democrat in the last week or so. Pennsylvania has done a little bit the opposite, where the race has narrowed, right? Someone I know in Philadelphia said to me, Pennsylvania is a weird state, right? It has a lot of liberals living in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and as Kevin pointed out, the suburbs have been going more blue lately as well, right? At the same time, in those same suburbs, you've had a lot of, what I hear is that you have a lot of Orthodox Jews who have been moving there from New York. And so that also changes the vote now, especially with the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? A lot of those voters are voting for Trump. So it's not surprising that Pennsylvania is such a toss-up. I think, and at the same time, while we might have a result a little bit sooner this time, if the result is close, then I would expect an information battle that will continue for a little bit longer. There will be the dispute over the numbers. I could see that if the race is close in Pennsylvania, I could see that dispute dragging for longer.
So just to jump in on that, which I think is exactly right, Trump pushed this very hard right after election night in 2020, of course, in Pennsylvania in particular. And there was an attempt by the legislature there to change so they could start counting the mailed-in ballots before the polls closed, so that you wouldn't have this long and complicated lag. And Republicans who'd previously supported that effort, because some of this is just hygienic and like good housekeeping stuff, turned out against it. So we know that there's going to be some lag with information there. We know the mail-in vote isn't going to match up with the in-person vote. And then there'll be attempts, I suspect, to say there's something wrong with these numbers. How could they have shifted this way, narratively and then maybe legally? And that's likely to be a point of contention if Pennsylvania is close. I've heard from a lot of Republicans today who are partisan but knowledgeable, who are very enthusiastic about Pennsylvania, who think they've shrunk the difference in mail-in votes, that they're going to do very well with in-person, and feel really optimistic about their chances there. But I don't know how to gauge any of that. And I know we're going to have results very soon, so I'm just listening.
And both of you said like this. Not both of you. I admire like you led with this information battle. A battle will be fought out in any close state. Both of you said that. And this dovetails with the fact that disinformation has been at an all-time high in this election. And after 2020 and 2016, I didn't think it could get any worse than that. But it seems to be, here we are 4 years later, whoever owns the disinformation battle might be able to affect voter turnout. Because as of last night, they were saying there are doctored videos going around telling people not to come out and vote in some states and counties. There are fake messages being sent to people telling them, everything is rigged already. So this idea of like owning the narrative and owning the disinformation narrative, at times in this election feels like we're talking about the same thing.
I think that's a very good point. In terms of the disinformation narrative affecting voter turnout, I think it can affect voter turnout. I think the disinformation narrative should be understood in the context of these are marginal gains that people are shooting for. I don't think it's something that in itself will decide like a huge block of voters for Trump or Harris, right? But these are gains on the margins, and in tight races, that's very important. At the same time, more so than voter turnout, the feeling that I get from everything I've been reading and hearing is that the disinformation campaign that I think is most concerning right now is less focused on turnout, less focused on getting people to vote in a certain way, and more focused on shaping the narrative of what the result will turn out to be. So I think it's quite, New York Times had a very good article on Polymarket. There's been this whole wave of knowledgeable, so people were suddenly knowledgeable about the fact that gambling odds are really reliable. They're very good, right? And Polymarket has been promoted massively on X, on Elon Musk's X. Polymarket is a gambling odds company that suddenly out of nowhere decided Trump had an over 70% chance of winning. This was being put in everyone's face on Twitter, on X, I'm going to say Twitter. That's what I'm used to. On Twitter for the weeks leading up to the election, right? That shapes a narrative.
And this was the one, if I remember correctly, it was basically those odds moved drastically because one person in France bet $30 million in total on Trump. So one person bet $30 million. First of all, congratulations on having that money to bet, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is one person changed the odds. And the moment the odds change, that becomes a news story. And the news story, if that gets repeated enough, it's like, it becomes the truth.
And in a post-election period when maybe people are not so sure about what happened, what the results are, it softens people up to be receptive to the idea that Trump won, right?
Yeah.
To continue on the Polymarket thing, because I think this is actually very important. Polymarket is funded by Peter Thiel, who was one of Donald Trump's major backers. Polymarket pays Nate Silver, who has recently been a big part of shaping what the election result narrative can look like, right? And Peter Thiel's former business partner, Elon Musk, is promoting Polymarket and Nate Silver on X relentlessly as they say, oh, these numbers, they show this and this, but my gut says Trump is going to win. So all of this is kind of I think the Republicans are doing a better job of shaping the narrative than the Democrats. Let's just put it that way.
Harry.
I want to argue just a little because I've been thinking a ton about Polymarket and everything you said was interesting and I think spot on. So this French guy who put in this giant bet that tilted the markets, the Wall Street Journal found him, and it looks like after a lot of speculation about this guy, never mind for a second Elon Musk, we'll get back to them, was just a guy who thought the odds were off and he had a chance to win a boodle of money. Or so the guy says.
Sure.
So that's interesting. Of course, that says nothing about other people choosing to do similar things in other settings. With disinformation, about half the country, right, and this sort of is the split we have, thinks the issue is censorship. And a question of who's throttling information right before an election, what isn't allowed into the discourse, and argues the whole issue and the framing very differently. Musk, of course, has been very prominent on that, and in some ways, maybe that's an interesting and principled take. At the same time, you have this guy who bought Twitter, said he didn't do this as a profit thing, but has made himself the main character there. I see on my own feed is amplifying himself while promoting Trump outrageously and endlessly. And it sort of slopped the whole thing up. And this is a huge, fascinating thumb on the scale from an outside actor who's going to run, if Trump wins, apparently, this cut the government by a third commission and has tremendous government contracts. And should the government step in to stop that? I don't know. I think these are incredibly difficult questions and ones I hope that voters here and Americans and citizens around the world think really seriously about as we get through this election. When you're talking again about 10,000 people in one state, and that's the whole thing in a divided country, that is a powerful thumb on the scale. There's central communication medium and the one that all the journalists are on still. And changing it and just changing how its algorithms work and how its owner works as a very public character who's playing like a public Tony Stark role, I think ridiculously, but it's appealing to a lot of people evidently, and he's very able to amplify that. And is this how we want to make these decisions? Is this the sort of conversation we want to have? There's something very strange and brand new about it that I don't think is going to sink in until after we've voted, just given the timing here. In some ways, that has been, I think, the October surprise.
Yeah. I'm going to take a little thread from both of you, right? We talked about Nate Silver, Golden Boy, predicted Obama, predicted every single state in 2008. And we talk about the polls, and the polls keep saying it's a dead heat. And they have said this consistently across so long. What does that, what do we make of this when even after they're saying it's a dead heat? Today is election day. People are out and voting right now, right? That they also say, a little asterisk with every poll is, it could be a landslide, but wait, in either direction. So the polls are both a dead heat, and this is just how I guess statistics work. It's a dead heat, and the landslide could be in either direction, and then they're asking us to say, don't be surprised by this landslide in either direction. I find that so interesting, and people like Nate Silver who have now moved on to these very peculiar, nebulous roles. It's exactly. I think I find that difficult to understand, and also at the same time so cynical. And then okay, why do we poll then?
Harry, I want to defer to you on this, but I want to ask, like, do you think the fact that it's an electoral college has something to do with it, where small changes in, within polling error, within the margin of polling error, can result in several states swinging for Harris or Trump and result in what seems like a landslide in the electoral college? That would be my initial kind of guess on that.
We would have a different set of tactical considerations if it all came down to the popular vote and where the margins were there and where you could turn more people out, where you could cheat in different ways or be accused of cheating and all that. Absolutely. But I think squinting, it would be a similar mess where like highly staked professionals in a very divided country are finding the places where they think they can make, as you were saying, like marginal differences that could play out in outsized ways.
I meant more along the lines of, like, in terms of what Nader's saying about it could either be really close or it could be a landslide on either side. So that's more like in that sense that, okay, it is within polling error, from what I understand, that if Harris, if the polls are underestimating Harris, she could take several states, which suddenly gives her more than 350 electoral votes, right? Even though it's, in percentages.
It's sports. It's all sports. It's terrible. And like, we have to do a little of this as we're about to have the result of the contest. And in the meantime, there's this range of outcomes. And if Harris has played the identical game and she wins or she loses, or it's a landslide, like how this is perceived and how it's written about and the decisions she's made, and let's make Liz Cheney the closing argument or whatever, like resonate totally differently. So the same way I go out, I throw the same pitches, the same things happen, and the other team gets 2 runs. If my team gets 3 or 7 or 0, the story I'm writing, and I'm starting in the 7th inning, no doubt, because it's going to be deadline pressure, is totally different. And there's something unhealthy about that, but also unavoidable. And this also, of course, goes back to the betting propositions, which are not new, but it's really interesting. This is the first election just at the very end where Americans can legally bet on the results. And here we are, and then we're going to find out who gets paid off.
And I'd like to add another wrinkle to that, to Peter Thiel and Polymarket, because Peter Thiel also was the person who essentially made J.D. Vance who he was, because he found, J.D. Vance, I think, worked for one of his startups who worked with him. That was his first thing, because Peter Thiel went to Yale, gave a speech. J.D. Vance was inspired by him, contacted him later, and Peter Thiel became J.D. Vance's mentor, and we all see where J.D. Vance is right now. So these layers, we seem to keep adding to them.
If I can add one more layer,
I like that.
I think related again to Polymarket is what I think is I found very fascinating this election cycle is this kind of underground crypto movement supporting Trump. And I think there's something very interesting, because one of the big investors in Polymarket, along with Peter Thiel, was, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, so apologies, Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because what crypto, I think, represents is the ability to keep your wealth away from the reach of the government, right?
Yes.
So that's what crypto represents. And that's one way where I've talked about how Trump's, maybe there is a lack of enthusiasm for Trump compared to 2016, but one way where I think Trump has expanded his base is into wealthy people who perhaps in 2016 were less interested in someone as chaotic as him, right? They now see him as someone who can help preserve their wealth.
Hulk Hogan, we got to throw in here
Hulk
too.
Hogan, wrestling and Hulk Hogan.
Exactly.
Peter Thiel funded his lawsuit against
Gawker. Against Gawker, exactly.
And Hulk Hogan then shows up, forgive me, but basically with an American flag and humping a boa at Trump's closing rally at Madison Square Garden. And I'm like, we are post-idiocracy. But if there's enough money on the line, and the crypto world is a strong example of that, and Trump's saying, I'm going to make this good for you guys and your money, again, which he is, that's a really powerful, strange, and interesting thumb on the scale. And from people whose fundamental goal is contesting government, just in the most basic Weberian level, we need a way for our money to be outside of its reach and awareness.
DJT is pumping today.
Exactly.
DJT stock is pumping today.
And first of all, I didn't know that. Thank you for that. When you talk about, I think the note that you added was like such a valid one, because it brings us to the media, it brings us to Peter Thiel. I forgot that he was the person who funded Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against Gawker. Gawker went bankrupt, it closed down, and
I'll never forget that.
And what it created was a little bit of the
kind of cautious media environment we have today is a direct outcome of that.
Gawker was doing some of the best journalism at the time.
Yeah. I'm gonna move on from here. I both like the take and I both agree with it and disagree with parts of that. As we enter the final couple of minutes we have over here, I've read a couple of in the front page of the New York Times today, right? There's like a headline over here that says fears of violence and a sense of uncertainty. Front page of the New York Times on election day. And then after I read this, I was reading a few other articles. I saw some pictures of barricades being put up around Washington. Did you think we would ever reach the state where on election day, one of the major thoughts in the capital of this country is the protection of the instruments of power over there? How have we ended up over here?
It's terrible, it's messy, it has a tremendous amount to do with Donald Trump. That said, I thought the Times today was atrocious.
Oh, I like
thought
that.
Everything in the paper was editorializing and was uninteresting. And then they had the editorial board members and columnists being like, here's why I'm voting, and I dedicate my vote to like a 56-year-old granny in a swing state. Like, what is this? But the whole paper had that should, ought, editorialing tone, whereas the Journal did not and had some interesting coverage. Like, there is fear and dread.
I'll push back on that because this is just a statement of fact that there is fear, there's some uncertainty, and barricades are going up in Washington, D.C. today, though. I think that's a real concern, though. How did we get here is my question.
But a real concern is different from a real thing.
Sure.
And when real things happen, reporting on them seriously, scrupulously, and well is super important. But again, speaking of thumbs on the scale, I've got a knot in my stomach about this one for certain.
Yeah.
But I just think getting ahead of the news with the dread that we're feeling and the directions things could be going in is an unhealthy thing.
Yeah.
For me, I think in 2016, before 2016, I think I was fairly naive, or I think of myself as fairly naive, and I would have probably said no. I don't think things would get to this stage. After that, I think I wouldn't say I'm surprised that things have come to this. I agree, however, with what Harry is saying, which is that in terms of how you're covering this and presenting this, there's an aspect of it where it's I feel like for the media it's also a little bit of fun to be dramatic about things as well, right? So it's not to dispute what you're saying about that. However, I think for me, coming at it from a Bangladeshi context, where I have seen a lot of election violence, seen a lot of voter suppression going on very violently, that's something that I think before 2016 I would have had a more naive approach of, America's institutions are strong and so can withstand that, and now I don't have that attitude anymore is what I'm trying to say.
I lost some of that, and this is nothing like the Bangladeshi context, so I don't mean to say this glibly, but in 2000, when the Brooks Brothers riot happened, which Roger Stone, Trump advisor, helped organize, and they shut down some of the counting in Florida, when Florida was like Pennsylvania is now. It's like the thing maybe it all comes down to.
Broward County.
And then, and then the Supreme Court stepped in and said a decision, and this guy will be president. And the logic is totally inscrutable and involved small technical issues no one actually cared about, but everything was at stake. And then they said, oh, and by the way, this Supreme Court decision is not precedential. It only applies in this one circumstance that won't repeat, and this guy will be president. And then many things happen afterward, and the next year, of course, but that sort of set American history on the course we're on now, and it was on a much smaller level. We will not accept this result, we will not accept this counting, and we will signify violence and disruption and shutting things down and literally snatching at ballots and scaring counters if we're not getting our way. And flash forward 24 years, and I picked on the Times, but I do have a feeling of dread.
Yeah. I think, first of all, I think picking on the Times is par for the course for them. I think that's okay, and encourage it over here. They enjoy it, exactly. And we're gonna leave with like one question to both of you. Tomorrow morning we wake up, and let's say it's a landslide for Kamala Harris. I'm creating a very specific scenario. A landslide, or it's a close one for Kamala Harris. How does Donald Trump respond, and how do his supporters respond?
I don't want to speculate, but I
Sure.
am concerned
Yeah.
to see how this plays out, and I think how his supporters respond will have a great deal to do with how Trump chooses to respond in the event. And this is weird, we're talking about winning an election, but what winning means is now this weird and complicated
contested.
question.
Yeah.
I am truly concerned about that, and then we have this long period between the votes being cast and the actual transfer of power that is the place for mischief,
Yeah.
potentially. And I think you could, in interesting ways, ask this the other way around. Part of Trump's defense is that Hillary Clinton never really accepted that I won and
Yeah.
seeded this like fairly phony narrative about Russian collusion and with help from the intelligence agencies and did this right before the election and then spent years dismissing me and all the institutional powers try to stop me. I'm trying to be fair here
Sure, yeah.
to that perspective.
Yeah.
But I do think what I'm praying for is to just have an accepted result, and then, okay, here we are. Here's the work each of us has to do, like in
Yeah.
our own communities, in terms of political organizing, whether we like it or not. And I think a lot of people are pulling for some sort of split government and an acceptance of that government. But we're going to see. The boarding up the residents, that really is very scary.
Yeah. Final thoughts, Maher?
I'll run with your hypothetical here. Let's say
Yeah.
Harris wins landslide.
Yeah.
Trump campaign denies victory,
Yeah.
but perhaps with less energy than if it was a tighter race.
Okay.
Trump's supporters, I think, mainly don't have the enthusiasm that they would have if there was a tighter race
Sure.
to support that dispute, give it the power that it would need. But a certain section of them goes deeper into election denial conspiracies.
And if it's tight? I said one more question. What if it's tight tomorrow?
I don't have. If it's a tight Harris victory,
Yeah.
I am skeptical of whether the Democrats have the ability to defend it, but who knows?
Wow, that's a spectacular take. And with you?
I don't really drink, but tomorrow might be the day.
Okay, fair enough. On that note, thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you to both my guests in the studio, everyone who called in via Zoom, and Mr. Mamdani, who's left the studio so far. Thank you all for being with us. We have one more day of coverage tomorrow, and tomorrow I guess we'll have a slightly clearer picture. We hope to see you then. Thank you.